Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Sirauki, Assistant Curator at DIA, and I want to welcome all of you to this fourth and last chapter in the lecture series, Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization, which is a part of DIA's discussions in contemporary culture. This program receives partial funding from the New York Department of Cultural Affairs that I would like to acknowledge here. And I would also like to thank my colleagues at DIA, without whom the organization of this program would not have been possible. Yasmil Raymond, Kelly Kivland, Megan Whitco, Andriana Campbell, Max Tolson, Silvia Benedetti, Blair Babcock, Max Tanone, and Dan Wolf. As in previous sessions, before I introduce our two guest speakers, Rosalyn Deutsche and Chris Kraus, I would like to say a few words to contextualize this series that comes to a closure today. Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization aims to map out spaces and practices where contemporary definitions of the monument may be found at work. In every session, we have brought together scholars and critics whose approaches to the question coalesced in a specific territory rather than an institutionalized field. Monuments, as we've seen, always reveal continuities, bringing our attention from archaeology to propaganda, from urban planning to fetishism, from resistance to museology, and from nostalgia to iconoclasm. The search for a unifying concept was excluded from the start. And perhaps the only common trait to all presentations in this cycle is the effort to recognize the historical present, confronting time and again the mutations of our material culture and the technologies of cultural memory. At the risk of sounding apologetic, I will say that the reasons for this debate may rely less on the need for a totalizing category than on a certain excess of specimens and modalities. In a society that forgets at the same speed it hyper-memorializes, meaning retweets, for instance, the very idea of a thing that reminds, a monumentum, becomes omnipresent and almost inescapably spurious. Monuments proliferating around us, including the short-lived bust of Edward Snowden in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, seem more focused on competing for attention than in their ancient job of reminding. Their conceptual urgency goes hand in hand with their thirst for dissolution. Precisely the recent emergence and withdrawal of a monument to Edward Snowden, it was transported and erected in a park during the morning of April 6th, by a group of anonymous artists and dismantled the same day by local authorities. This event seems serendipitously connected to some of the ideas that we may be discussing today. Not only because Snowden has been recognized by many as the hero he never wanted to become, perhaps aware of the patriarchal connotations that are implicit in a figure, the hero, that Professor Deutsche will address in a few minutes. But also because the clandestine erection of a bust, again, none of these terms are innocent, interestingly brings to mind some of Deutsche's considerations on the concepts of public space and the regulated use of the latter in several of her acclaimed essays. And I will quote from a key passage in Tilted Arc and the Uses of Democracy, which is part of Evictions. Public space emerges with the abandonment of the belief in an absolute basis of social unity, a basis that gives, quote-unquote, the people, an essential identity or true interest. Public space, in this view, is the uncertain social realm where, in the absence of an absolute foundation, the meaning of the people is simultaneously constituted and put at risk. End of quote. On the other hand, erasure and the clandestine, the disappearance of the monument and the spectacle of its ruin, as well as the fetishistic veneration of the hero, will be recurring ideas in the text Chris Kraus will be reading to us. I will say that the excavation of significant chains that Kraus's writings systematically exert seems essential for any honest consideration of the issues I've tried to enumerate thus far. Likewise, any understanding of the concept of monument at large will be inconsolably mutilated in the absence of a feminist critique. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Rosalyn Deutsche and Chris Kraus for accepting our invitation to speak here today. As you see on the brochure we have distributed, there will be a 15-minute intermission between the first and the second presentation, during which iced tea and pastries will be served. And I'm lowering the tone now. And after the second lecture, we will still have about 30 minutes for a panel discussion and Q&A where all of you are invited to formulate comments and questions. And now, without further ado, I will give you a few facts about the trajectory of Professor Rosalyn Deutsche, our first speaker today. Professor Deutsche is a writer and scholar currently teaching modern and contemporary art at Barnard College, Columbia University in New York. Deutsche has written extensively and lectured internationally on such interdisciplinary topics as art and urbanism, art and the public sphere, art and the Declaration of Rights, art and war, and feminist theories of subjectivity in visual representation. Her essays have appeared in Grey Room, October, Art Forum, Art in America, Texte sur Kunst, and Assemblage, among other journals, as well as numerous exhibition catalogs and anthologies. A faculty member of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program, Deutsche is the author of Evictions, Art and Spatial Politics, published by MIT Press in '96, and Hiroshima After Iraq, 3 Studies in Art and War, published by Columbia University Press in 2010. And with this, I will leave you with Rosalyn Deutsche. Please join me in welcoming her to DIA.
Thank you, Manuel, for that introduction, and thanks to DIA for inviting me. It's great to be here. I was around for the first round of the discussions in contemporary culture in the '80s, and I hope this will be more civilized than they were back then. For those, I can hear some people giggling who were there. My talk is called We Don't Need Another Hero. Can everyone hear me? No? Did I hear a no? Now can you hear me? Can everyone hear me now? Okay. So my talk is called We Don't Need Another Hero. At the height of World War I, the British author Ivor Gurney wrote a poem that illustrates the relationship between memorialization and repression. Titled To His Love, Gurney's poem is a homoerotic monologue in which a soldier addresses the lover of another soldier who has been killed in the war. To His Love begins as a traditional pastoral elegy. He's gone, and all our plans are useless indeed. We'll walk no more on Cotswold where the sheep feed quietly and take no heed. The second stanza mentions the dead soldier's body. It was so quick, but is not as you knew it. You would not know him now. But the next few lines banish this sinister reference. Still, he died nobly. So cover him over with violets of pride, purple from Severin's side. Nothing prepares us for the desperation of the final stanza. Cover him soon, and with thick-set masses of memoried flowers, hide that red, wet thing I must somehow forget. Two transformations take place in the course of Gurney's poem. The soldier's body that was so quick turns into that red, wet thing, a mutilated body. And a commemorative tribute, violets of pride, which by virtue of their association with kingship symbolize the nobility of death in war, becomes an instrument of deception. Thick-set masses of memoried flowers conceal the ghastly corpse. The urgent plea of Gurney's soldier that his friend's mangled body be driven from memory may be understandable as a personal way of coping with traumatic loss, a symptom of pathological, or what the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur calls wounded memory. But the imperatives of public remembrance extend beyond mourning and even beyond commemoration. It is a commonplace to assert that one of the major purposes of memorializing human-inflicted disasters, such as war, is to prevent their recurrence. Routinely, we are told that a memorial, simply by its presence, will help build a better, less violent world. Yet, like Gurney's Violets of Pride, conventional war memorials stress the nobility of the cause, the worthiness of the sacrifice, the greatness of the victory, and in this way, divert attention from the war-wrecked body. As a consequence, they doom their ostensibly future-oriented projects to failure. For not only does the repression of the wounded body dispose of the true war memorial, the hurt body in which the record of war survives, not only does it turn away from the reality of war, which, as Elaine Scarry writes, resides in the incontestable reality of the body in pain, the body maimed, the body dead and hard to dispose of, the body in which the nation has literally inscribed itself. But even more dangerously, the censorship of the wounded body resurrects the condition that, according to Freud, makes war possible: regression to the fantasy of the invulnerable body, or as Freud calls it, heroism. 2 years before Gurney wrote To His Love, Freud too reflected on the horrors of the First World War, arguing that the secret of heroism in war is lack of belief in one's own death. The disbelief represents a withdrawal from reality and move toward the phantasmatic security of primary narcissism, which children use to protect themselves during the process of self-formation. The rational grounds for heroism, says Freud, rest on a judgment that the subject's own life cannot be as precious as certain abstract and general goods. But more frequent, in my view, is the instinctive and impulsive heroism which knows no such reasons and flouts danger in the spirit of nothing can happen to me. The heroic reaction, Freud explains, corresponds to the unconscious, which does not acknowledge death. Recently, a United States Marine captain confirmed Freud's analysis when he recalled that until one of his own men was killed, our deployment in Afghanistan had been exhilarating because we felt invulnerable. This invulnerability in an environment of death was the most powerful sensation I'd ever experienced. I felt favored and possessed with the power to do anything. Anyone who seriously hopes to make the world less warlike would do well to begin by reading Virginia Woolf, who, as Roger Poole suggests, may be war's greatest theoretician. The same year that Freud psychoanalyzed heroism, and 23 years before her own Three Guineas, a radically feminist anti-war polemic which attributes war to the infantilism and grandiosity of patriarchal behavior, Woolf published her first novel, The Voyage Out. Early in the story, a group of vacationers spots a fleet of British warships and at lunch afterwards talk about valor in battle, praising the magnificence of British admirals. No one liked it then when Helen Ambrose, the feminist among them, remarked, "As for dying on a battlefield, surely it was time we ceased to praise courage." About 70 years later, as the US increased its involvement in the First Persian Gulf War, Barbara Kruger echoed Ambrose's sentiment in a billboard and photomontage that linked escalating militarism to masculinism. We don't need another hero. especially when he flexes his phallic biceps. As we've seen, Ivor Gurney expressed similar feelings, precisely by showing that memorialization covers the reality of war. Gurney uncovered it, and in doing so, attacked an entire tradition of World War I poetry. To His Love embodies a shift in British poetry from Keatsian lyricism to raw, aghast reportage, observes Glyn Maxwell. In the poem's last line, we hear the sound of a culture's poetic history cracking in half. Today, in an era of perpetual war, poets no longer exalt death in war, though politicians do. Heroism still figures in pro-war propaganda, especially when it perpetuates the long-standing poetic tradition of linking war to the struggle for liberty, and in this way transforming it into something beautiful, no matter how hellish. Just as on the eve of World War I, Germany's chancellor proclaimed, "We are not driven by the desire for conquest, but are driven by the highest principles," so in 2003, President Bush gave the invasion of Iraq what Rosa Luxemburg calls a democratic halo, describing it as a mission bringing freedom, democracy, and justice to the Iraqi people. Vice President Cheney strengthened Bush's portrayal by banning media coverage of American bodies returning from Iraq. Memory exercised in the interests of power is what Walter Benjamin had in mind when he wrote that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. Paul Ricoeur calls this kind of memory instrumental memory. Like the pathological memory of Gurney's traumatized soldier, instrumental memory seeks to conceal the reality of war, only it does so by placing war within the narrative of greatness that Nietzsche dubs monumental history, the history of the victors. Resistance to war requires, by contrast, a different kind of memory, one that commemorates war by de-idealizing it, uncovering that red, wet thing. Gurney uses this phrase to designate the shocking body of his dead comrade and to represent the horrors of war more generally. But insofar as it stands for all the dark things repressed by instrumental memorialization, that red, wet thing can denote not only war's awful consequences, but its dark, irrational causes as well. While the political, economic, demographic, and ideological causes of war are well recognized, almost no one wants to think about the role played by what Leo Bersani describes as the intractable destructiveness intrinsic to being human. Acknowledging unconscious aggression, the passion to injure, profoundly disillusions us about ourselves, making it impossible to believe that violence always belongs to someone else. Yet, as Jacqueline Rose writes, the subterranean aspects of the human play their part in driving the world on its course. They must therefore be faced if we want to establish a better future. Art has something to contribute to this project, something other than agitprop activities. For if, as Judith Barry argues, art can make a space for hitherto unthought configurations of reality, it can also make a space for the unsettling realities we don't want to think about. Contemporary artists have assumed the responsibility of bringing to the surface the darkest aspects of war, and some, as we shall see, have done so by entering into a dialogue with the traditional commemorative forms that repress them. Modern warfare severely challenges the fantasy of the invulnerable body on which war depends. Gurney's depiction of a soldier's dead body is a far cry from the one in Homer's Iliad, wherein King Priam says, "For a young man, all is decorous when he is cut down in battle and torn with the sharp bronze, and lies there dead. And though dead, still all that shows about him is beautiful. Homer's dead body, though wounded, remains intact. Gurney's is an unrecognizable thing. It is likely that Gurney's compatriot was killed by one of the Great War's technologically advanced weapons, which destroyed bodies on an unprecedented scale. He may have been hit by an artillery shell that tore bodies to pieces or produced deep, wide perforations, or by a high-speed, dome-tipped bullet that reduced the soft tissues and blood vessels to a devitalized pulp. Inside the body, the bullet may have somersaulted, tearing tissues, shattering bones, and leaving ragged-edged exit wounds. Those are descriptions from A History of Military Medicine. The gruesome injuries of World War I prefigure those of later wars. Ann Jones reports that in Afghanistan, for instance, IEDs produce blasts so strong that they rise into the perineal area where the two legs meet to smash genitals and into the pelvic cavity to pulverize soft tissue and sever intricate bodily systems. Sometimes they disintegrate the body into such tiny fragments that it returns to earth in a snowfall of flesh. And soldiers crawl around the blast site, scraping at the soil with their fingernails for some remains of their vaporized comrade to put in a body bag with which they came equipped. In the aftermath of World War I, widely publicized medical, surgical, and bodybuilding campaigns labored to reconstruct the male body. At the same time, a frenzy of commemoration sought to revive the masculinist dream of corporeal inviolability. Classical ideals became a vehicle of both attempts. Classicizing memorials, while functioning as sites of mourning, were also designed to transform memory, a transformation conducted in the name of healing, commonly a euphemism for shifting attention from the war-ruined body to discourses of valor, glory, and honor. Monumental classicism, says Anna Carden Coyne, created an alternative architectural body. Classical architectural structures replaced the fragmented bodies of those whose names were inscribed on them with a beautiful, unified whole body. Not surprisingly, commemorative forms never honored the disabled and still don't. One of the most popular motifs decorating World War I memorials is the winged figure of Nike, Greek goddess of victory, companion of Roman emperors, and in later centuries, a visible manifestation of triumph. The best known is the marble Nike of Samothrace, which, since its discovery in 1863, has become a cultural icon, crystallizing, in Marina Warner's words, the concept of classical victory for the contemporary public more than any other, and exerting an immeasurable effect on the public iconography of glory. A photograph by Louise Lawler depicts the detached wings of this Nike, or, as the protruding pin makes clear, the wings of a plaster version of this Nike, one of countless copies in museums around the world. Lawler shot Nike's wings in 2005 when they were lying on blocks on the floor of the National Gallery in Oslo during the reinstallation of the museum's plaster cast collection. Lawler had visited the city more than a decade earlier, and at that time took a picture of several statues in the collection, including Nike, using it in one of her paperweight works. In 2005, however, the US was waging wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, wars that had been launched as part of a post-9/11 campaign comparable to the one following World War I to reconsolidate the nation's heroic masculinity. Lawler captioned her 2005 image, Grieving Mothers, Attachment. She followed it in 2008 with a smaller crop named Grieving Mothers, Still. By that time, Nike's wings were no doubt reattached to her torso, but the war on terror continued. In the 1980s, in what now appears as a precedent for grieving mothers, Lawler had produced a group of photographs of classical and neoclassical statues in museum settings. Some of the figures were conquering heroes. Works like The Rude Museum and Statue Before Painting, Perseus with the Head of Medusa by Canova, testified to Lawler's long-standing war consciousness. With bold croppings, strange angles of vision, and witty, suggestive juxtaposition, these works attack the integrity of militarized male bodies, subjecting their phallic pretensions to ridicule. Although the grieving mothers picture a female statue, they nonetheless belong to this group. Nike, like Perseus, materializes a desire for conquest, and images of female perfection function as idealized self-images of the masculinist subject, which is to say they are fetishes. Like the classical sculptures that populate Lawler's earlier works, the statue of the goddess is a symbol of the wished-for presence that will guarantee wholeness, a phallus and a flying one at that. A larger version of the flying phallus charms hung around the necks of Roman generals. The relationship of Lawler's captions to the images they accompany are usually ambiguous, and the title Grieving Mothers, reinforcing the image's association with war, is especially rich in interpretive possibilities. Do the detached wings symbolize the grieving mothers? Or do they stand for fallen soldiers that the mothers are attached to and grieve for? Are they severed limbs of wounded soldiers? Perhaps Nike herself has metamorphosed into a grieving mother, as she did in certain World War I memorials that portray her not as a belligerent figure, but a nurturing one. An example is the statue on the British Stalybridge War Memorial, which maternalizes Nike, albeit in her Christian incarnation as an angel of victory. Likewise, the sculptor of the figure on the Folkestone Memorial intended the Nike-like statue to represent motherhood while at the same time embodying the triumphant intact nation. These Nike typify the kind of reaction to traumatic loss that Eric Santor calls narrative fetishism. The construction and deployment of a narrative consciously or unconsciously designed to expunge the traces of the trauma or loss that called the narrative into being in the first place. The narrative fetish tries to deny trauma by simulating a condition of intactness or by conveying uplifting, self-serving messages. In this manner, Nike was occasionally conscripted into the story of World War I as a paradigm of grieving that also stood for victory, patriotism, peace, and sacrifice. Her presence exalted grief as service to the nation. In fact, World War I propaganda equated the sacrifice of mothers with that of war heroes, recruiting the image of grieving mothers for the war effort, as in this poster showing potential grieving mothers surrendering their sons. A more flagrant exploitation of mothers was a 1916 letter sent to the editor of the Morning Post from a little mother. Women, writes the little mother, are created for the purpose of giving life, and men to take it. Now we are giving it in a double sense. It is we who mother the men who have upheld the honor and traditions not only of our empire, but of the whole civilized world. The Little Mother letter elicited grateful testimonials, like the one from a bereaved mother. I have lost my 2 dear boys, but since I was shown the Little Mother's beautiful letter, a resignation too perfect to describe has calmed all my aching sorrow, and I would now gladly give my sons twice over. Clearly, maternal grief does not in itself challenge instrumental war memory. Although it deeply touched the Queen, the Little Mother letter was a fake, probably written by an editor of the Post and widely distributed as a propaganda pamphlet to counter calls for peace negotiations. But in 2005, the year that Lawler produced Grieving Mothers, a genuine grieving mother refused induction into the war propaganda machine. Cindy Sheehan's son, Casey, had been killed in Iraq. Sheehan regretted allowing him to be buried as a soldier and built an alternative memorial to him in the form of an extended anti-war protest outside President Bush's Texas ranch, naming it Camp Casey. The self-described peace mom demanded accountability from the president about how he had conducted the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. "I want to ask George Bush, why did my son die?" she told reporters. "I don't want him to use my son's name or my family name to justify any more killing. If he even starts to say freedom and democracy, I'm going to say bullshit." Recollecting her journey through heartache to activism, she recommends that mothers stand up and say, "No, I'm not giving my child to the fake patriotism of the war machine, which chews up my flesh and blood to spit out profits." Sheehan's words have a quality that is frequently ascribed to Lawler's art: poignancy, a term that, as Douglas Crimp points out, means both moving and pointed. The poignancy of Grieving Mother's attachment stems from its caption, of course, but also from the artist's treatment of its thematic content, the detached wings of Nike, which are laden with symbolic connotations: brokenness, harm, fragmentation, suffering, incapacitation, castration. Like war memorials, Lawler's photograph is inhabited by a tension between the presence and absence of a body, echoing what Carden Coyne calls the marked unease between the absent bodies memorialized and the colossal signs, such as Nike, directing the memory process. Iconography, titles, and gray tonality endow Grieving Mothers with a memorial mood. But Lawler reverses the way Nike is deployed in World War I memorials. Instead of displacing mutilated bodies with one that is complete, she turns Nike herself into a wounded body, maybe an injured soldier. Nike of Samothrace is already disarmed. But now she has lost the body part that ensures her divinity. Listen to Socrates in Plato's Phaedrus. "The natural property of a wing is to raise that which is heavy and carry it aloft to the region where the gods dwell. And more than any other bodily part, it shares in the divine nature." Nike is divine because, like God, material rules do not apply to her. But in Lawler's photographs, they do. Dusty footprints, and these are more legible in the second version, although I don't know if you can make them out, but those are footprints. So dusty footprints, legible in the smaller version of Grieving Mothers, cover the floor of the Oslo Museum on which Nike's plaster wings rest. However, the background, especially of the first version, is out of focus, and the blurriness, coupled with the absence of a horizon line, transforms the floor into a cloudy celestial realm, the region where the gods dwell, Nike's proper home. Yet the allusion to a heavenly sky doesn't mitigate the goddess's plight. Instead, it provides an idealized norm against which the gravity of her injury is heightened. Akin to the protagonist of a Greek tragedy, at the moment of the plot's reversal, Nike has undergone a change of fortune from security to vulnerability. As in Greek tragedy, the violence has occurred off stage. And Nike's fall stems from a fatal flaw in her character: overconfidence, hubris, the belief that nothing can happen to me. Especially in her monumental sculptural forms, Nike symbolizes the wish to solidify the heroic feeling. On this reading, Grieving Mothers evokes the grievous consequences of the violence caused by disavowing that, like plaster and even marble, we are susceptible to being wounded. Because the heroic fantasy originates in a defense against the losses that constitute us as human subjects, and because in phallocentric culture the female body signifies symbolic castration, it is hardly surprising that one of the fantasy's most grievous consequences is cruelty towards women. It would seem, writes Jacqueline Rose, that women's bodies are there to be punished, that the mere sight of them is itself a punishable offense. Just this year, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court criticized the inaction of the UN Security Council in securing the arrest of rapists in Darfur. Women and girls continue to bear the brunt of sustained attacks on innocent civilians, said the prosecutor, but this council is yet to be spurred into action. Victims of war rapes are asking themselves how many more women should be brutally attacked for this council to appreciate the magnitude of their plight. World War I monuments also failed to attend to female victims of war, never commemorating them. No Nike, not even a maternal one, protected women or grieved for their suffering. The goddess's negligence might have been partially rectified in 1998 had the Croatian artist Sanja Ivaković been allowed to execute a work that, like Grieving Mothers, would have initiated a dialogue with an existing war monument. Ivaković was invited to participate in Manifesta II, the European Biennale of Contemporary Art, which was being held that year in Luxembourg City, capital of the state of Luxembourg. In the center of the city, in Constitution Square, stands a 69-foot-tall granite obelisk erected in 1923 to memorialize Luxembourg citizens who fought against the Germans in World War I. At the foot of the obelisk, two bronze statues represent Luxembourg soldiers who volunteered to serve in the French army during the German occupation of their own country. One, who died for the fatherland, lies on a pedestal. A seated compatriot mourns him. Topping the obelisk is a larger-than-human-size gilded bronze neoclassical statue of a wingless yet still triumphant Nike, crowning the nation with a laurel wreath, Greek symbol of victory, Roman symbol of triumph, and Christian sign of Christ's victory over death. In October 1940, Germans who were again occupying the country pulled down the monument. It was reconstructed in the 1950s and now also commemorates Luxembourgers killed in the Second World War and the Korean War. The Nike sculpture gives the monument its popular name, Gelle Frau, the Golden Lady, because she stands for Luxembourg's independence from two occupations. She's also called the Queen of Freedom. For her contribution to Manifesta II, Ivaković submitted a proposal to remove the Nike statue from the Gelle Frau and reinstall it on the premises of the city shelter for abused women. In her new location, Nike would have defended female victims of violence and at the same time highlighted the disparity between the idealizing treatment of women's bodies in allegorical representations and the degrading treatment of actual women's bodies. The work might have suggested that both uses of the female body deprive women of agency. Considered too controversial, Ivakovich's proposal was rejected. Fortunately, 3 years later, Ivakovich resumed her conversation with the Gelafra, this time provoking an even fiercer controversy, which took place on television, in newspaper headlines, articles, internet discussions, and 2 parliamentary debates. Invited back to Luxembourg to take part in an exhibition dealing with national identity, Ivakovich created a same-size replica of the Gelafra. So this is Ivakovich's work. She installed it within walking distance of the original. So this is a really bad slide, but it shows the distance between the 2 monuments and how they appeared. In addition to using less permanent materials, wood and gilded polyester, Ivakovich changed the monument in 3 ways. The Nike at the top of her obelisk, though otherwise an exact copy of the Gelafra sculpture, is visibly pregnant. And here you see the 2 of them, the 2 Nikes side by side. And whereas the plinth of the Gelafra is inscribed with quotations celebrating national war heroes, each side of Ivakovich's plinth is divided into 3 horizontal registers of repeated words. 2 registers display French and German terms, the majority of which denote concepts historically conceived of as masculine, but symbolized by allegorical female figures: resistance, justice, liberty, independence, culture. Either a degrading or an idealizing English term for women, Madonna, virgin, whore, bitch, fills a 3rd register, so that the monument's base, instead of commemorating war heroism, literalizes its misogynistic foundation. Read in conjunction with the words on the plinth, the pregnant woman at the top of Ivakovich's memorial, emerging from the very figure that epitomizes the idealization of women, brings to mind the widespread, long-standing result of war for real women, rape. Ivakovich's 3rd change to the Gelafra was to rename it Lady Rosa of Luxemburg. This gesture doesn't physically move Nike, as the artist had hoped to do in her first proposal, but it symbolically resituates her, bringing her down from an abstract allegorical context into concrete historical circumstances. Her new situation transforms the Gelafra into an anti-war memorial and Nike into a political activist. For the Marxist philosopher Rosa Luxemburg, to whom the new name obviously refers, vehemently opposed World War I. She spent most of the war in prison for organizing anti-war demonstrations and encouraging conscientious objection to military conscription. Luxemburg's Junius pamphlet, smuggled out of jail in 1916, excoriates the German Social Democratic Party for supporting an imperialist war in the name of national defense. The interests of the bourgeois nation and of the international proletariat, insists Luxemburg, are not the same. In the present-day imperialistic milieu, there can be no national wars of defense, and any socialist policy which lets itself be governed merely by the isolated viewpoint of a single country is doomed in advance. Luxemburg also indicts war more generally, calling it methodical, organized, gigantic murder, possible only when a state of intoxication has been previously created. In a later text on the Russian Revolution, Luxemburg criticized Lenin's support of the right of nations to self-determination, and in this context wrote her most famous line: "Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently." Ivakovich was impressed by the fact that Luxembourg residents view the Gelafra as a symbol of freedom. But in dedicating her memorial to Rosa Luxemburg, she questions the notion of freedom the monument celebrates. Following in Rosa Luxemburg's footsteps, Ivakovich lifts freedom, and with it the war memorial, out of a restricted nationalist framework. She quotes Benedict Anderson, who describes the nation as a fraternity that makes it possible for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willingly to die for limited imaginings. Lady Rosa contests the collective narcissism of official memorials, which concern themselves only with the violence we, as a nation, have suffered and supposedly triumphed over. Bojana Pezic suggests that Ivakovich intervenes in narcissistic memory in yet another way, one that troubles the nation's would-be unity. Noting that due to sexual violation, women may remember wars differently than men, Pejic says that the pregnancy of Lady Rosa brings to mind women of the other side who were violated and raped in wars, yet scarcely honored as fallen heroines. Enemies were, of course, never represented in official World War I memorials. But in 1970, the French fluxist artist Robert Filiou made a work that even more emphatically than Lady Rosa repudiates nationalism in order to commemorate losses on the other side. Commémore, first installed at the Neue Gallery in Aix-la-Chapelle, not only talks with existing war monuments, but puts them into dialogue with one another. The key element of Filiou's conceptual work is a text in French and English that begins with a proclamation of intent, enumerating the work's objectives. To create a precedent that will spread one day to all the continents, to honor truly the memory of this century's war victims, to remind future generations of the futility and obscenity of nationalism, to transform the pompous, revengeful style history bequeathed us into a new and generous expression of our destiny. Therefore, the text continues, it is solemnly proposed to the European peoples that they begin exchanging their respective war memorials. To this end, the creation of a joint commission for the exchange of war memorials, Commémore is the acronym for that commission. To this end, the creation of a joint commission for the exchange of war memorials is suggested, whose activities will be accompanied by meditation and rejoicing. A final sentence makes Filiou's work not only an anti-war memorial, but what Eric Baudelaire calls an anti, in the sense of before-war memorial. Countries which nowadays are thinking of going to war are summoned to exchange their war memorials before, and instead of making it. Filiou illustrated his proposal with collages constructed from photographs of war monuments in Holland, Germany, and Belgium, which the artist cut out and swapped. So you can see that there's a photograph of one in Holland, and then he has placed it on the base of a Belgian one, and then the Belgian one is placed on the base of the Holland one. There were other collages as well, but I couldn't find any decent slides or images. So here are some slightly better ones. Comé-Moore exercises memory at an ethico-political level. Paul Ricoeur calls ethico-political memory the duty of memory. He cautions, however, that he is not referring to the obsession with commemoration that characterizes our historical moment. In fact, for Ricoeur, the current enthusiasm for commemoration is an abuse of the duty of memory because it short-circuits the work of critical history. But if the duty of memory can epitomize abuse in the exercise of memory, it can also exemplify the good use of memory, if it adds to mourning and to memory the imperative of justice. What conception of justice gives it ethical force? Ricoeur responds to the question in 3 steps. First, the duty of memory is the duty to do justice through memories to an other than the self. Second, the duty of memory as the duty of justice helps repay a debt to those who have gone before us. And finally, among those to whom we are indebted, the moral priority belongs to the victims, and the victim at issue is the other victim, other than ourselves. Justice, says Ricoeur, turns memory into a project, giving it the form of an imperative and of the future. Comé-Moore is a project. It asks us to confront the memory of those we have injured, challenging claims of innocence and goodness on our side. It brings the death of the enemy out of isolation, questioning the rigid separation of self and other. And it seeks to prevent impending violence. Placing the work of memory and of mourning under an ethical idea of justice, Filiu offers a glimpse of what might inspire genuine hope for a less warlike future. Thank you.
So we're going to resume. I hope the tea was good. And we will listen now to Chris Kraus. We're incredibly honored to have you, Chris, in the East Coast for a little bit. And I will just say again a few words to recall Chris Kraus's trajectory that I'm sure many of you, of course, know. She's a writer and critic based in Los Angeles. She's the author of numerous and acclaimed books such as I Love Dick, of course, published by Semiotext in 1997, Aliens and Anorexia, 2000. If I don't say the contrary, it's Semiotext. Video Green, Los Angeles Art and the Triumph of Nothingness, 2004. Torpor, which is a novel. Where Art Belongs, Semiotext, again, 2011, Summer of Hate, 2012, and Lost Properties, published by the Whitney Biennial in 2014. She is the co-editor with Sylvain Letranger of Hatred of Capitalism, a Semiotext reader, and she has also directed a number of film works, such as Traveling Light from 1990, How to Shoot a Crime, 87, I should have started by this one, and Gravity and Grace, which is the last to date, 96. So, if we're all ready, then let's welcome Chris Kraus.
Hi, thank you. Which is mine? Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, you could say that we're moving, from the macro to the micro here. I've been working the last months on what may or may not be a biography of the writer Kathy Acker. It's probably going to be less a biography than more a collection of essays. But somebody who had written a biography told me recently that like the whole key to how the biography is going to go is how the person starts the book. It's the first 2 pages give you the key. You know, if it's the childhood, it's going to be a psychoanalytic biography. I always knew that my first 2 pages were going to be about the memorials. The black comedy of the memorials, when the friends gather and they're, you know, the death always exacerbates all the tensions under the surface, and the memorial becomes a black comedy. And I guess the thing that interests, I'm certainly interested in Acker's work, or I wouldn't be writing the book. But I think a thing that interests me equally about Acker's work are the many different cultural milieux that she moved through. So anyway, yes, I use this as an opportunity, I guess, to kind of start what may be the first scene of the book, which is an account of the various memorials that took place after she died in Tijuana. And the piece is called Littoral Madness. She had a book called Literal Madness. It's a pun. Like everything in the past, everyone remembers it differently, and some of the people involved hardly remember it all. We're talking about something that happened more than 17 years ago. But on January 23rd, 1998, which was a Friday, friends of the late writer Kathy Acker drove from San Francisco to Fort Funston Park, about 25 minutes away, to scatter her ashes. She died 2 months before at an alternative clinic in Tijuana, where she received palliative care for late-stage metastasized cancer. The ash scattering, like the wake at Bob Gluck's house on December 13th, and the memorial reading at Slim's Bar, where Michelle Handelman recalls being booed off the stage, devolved into a kind of black comedy, the way these things often do. At Jackie Curtis's memorial, I remember Cookie Mueller standing up on the stage of La Mama halfway through an evening of readings and monologues, blinking back tears as she faced the dark auditorium. She had no speech prepared. I thought this was supposed to be a funeral, she said to the room, not a variety show. Speaking to Silver Lotringer, the film editor Steve Brown recalled how the elegantly planned nuptial suicide of danceteria MC Howie Montague among a small group of friends ended with a plastic bag over his head. He was a large man in the late stages of AIDS, and whoever arranged for the pills underestimated the dose. Before time accelerated, deaths among friends in the art world were like salt to a sting, bringing unresolved feuds to the surface. Now we care less or are nicer. Around this time last year, when I started working on what may or may not be a biography of Kathy Acker, I imagined beginning the book with the melee at Slim's Bar, or the wake, where a group of friends gathered to transfer her ashes from a box to an urn, or the scattering. To describe these proceedings would be to stage an establishing shot of a movie that uses a single protagonist to traverse an entire milieu. Although she wrote first-person fiction and gave hundreds of interviews in which she was asked to recite the facts of her life over and over again, these facts are hard to pin down in any literal way. Acker lied all the time. She was rich, she was poor, she was the mother of twins, she'd been a stripper for years, a guest editor of Film Comment magazine at the age of 14, a graduate student of Herbert Marcuse. She lied when it was clearly beneficial to her, and she lied even when it was not. Perceptive readers of Acker's work have observed that the lies weren't literal lies, but more a system of magical thought. As Dodie Bellamy notes in her essay Digging Through Kathy's Stuff, quote, over and over, Acker tells the same tale. The mother is pregnant with a daughter and the father leaves. The mother blames the daughter and tries to abort her. The daughter's body survives, but not her unified self. Is it true? Does it matter? Acker liberated libido from Freud's repressed underworld, unquote. But then again, didn't she do what all writers must do? Create a position from which to write. Acker's life was a fable, and to describe the confusion and love and conflicting agendas behind these memorials would be to sketch an apocryphal allegory of an artistic life in the late 20th century. It is girls from which stories begin, she wrote in her last notebook. And like other lives, but unlike most fables, it was created through means both within and beyond her control. By the time Acker died at age 50, she'd known thousands of people. Since her divorce from her second husband, Peter Gordon, in 1979, she'd had no long-term partner. She'd lived at different times in her life in San Diego, San Francisco, New York, and London, a half-conscious rotation between cities familiar to her. I think she was just always trying to find her community, the technology writer Are You Serious told me last year at a Mill Valley cafe. Michael Bracewell, who'd known her in London during the mid-1980s, concurred. She'd bought, then abandoned an apartment in Brighton. Her friend Gary Pulsifer doubts she ever spent a night there. Estranged from her remaining immediate family, she'd known poets and bikers, leather dykes, tattooists, philosophers, astrologers, renowned artists and writers, bodybuilders, psychics, promoters, and editors, and she slept with a great number of them. In London, she played chess with Salman Rushdie. She'd lived in San Francisco between 1990 and 96, teaching a class in new genres at the Art Institute while trying to find a more stable tenure-track job anywhere in the U.S. In San Francisco during those years, she worked out at Gold Gym, published 2 novels, toured constantly, recorded CDs, and added an enormous, impressive tattoo across her shoulders and upper back to the series of pictographs already inscribed on her body. Literal madness. Images written not just as words on the page, but as pictures on flesh. The tattoo, an enormous lizard-like fish overlaid with a garland of flowers that morphs into a sleek airborne bird, was done in the style of Ed Hardy and took weeks to complete. Her friend Kathy Brew recalls Acker coming into her office in the humanities department after each session and asking her, "Honey, would you put some cream on my back?" After the last session, Brew grabbed her camera and took a much reproduced photograph of a bare-chested Acker astride her 6,500cc motorcycle. We were just playing around. It felt like 2 girls playing dress-up or something. Brew was newly divorced, and during those years, the two hung out a lot, talking about being single, desire, and intimacy. And then in 94, Brew moved back to New York. By the time Acker left San Francisco for London in July 96, she'd stopped talking to a lot of her former friends in the city's literary world and cyberpunk scene. With some, there'd been feuds. Others couldn't handle her medical choices and denial of cancer, which had been diagnosed in April that year. When she returned to the city in September, she was no longer closely in touch with anyone from her old extensive and disparate circles. From a hotel, she called Aileen Mayer, an old colleague from the Art Institute. She'd known Mayer years before in New York, but in San Francisco, their friendship was distant at best. Mayer recalls running into Acker holding court at parties and openings, looking into the middle distance beyond her old friend. "Oh, come on, Kathy, I know you," Mayer felt like saying. Acker told Mayer she was sick, and although by then Mayer was working full-time and caring for a young child, within minutes of arriving at Acker's hotel room, she had a strong feeling, "I have to be there for this." Sharon Grace, another SFA colleague, became a key part of Acker's support system during those weeks in San Francisco, before her friend Matthias Viegner arrived from LA and arranged for her move from the UC Davis Medical Center to American Biologics, the only alternative clinic in Tijuana that would accept cancer patients at such a late stage. They arrived with a Buddhist nurse in a rental van on November 1st, the Mexican Day of the Dead. By the time Viegner returned to San Francisco with her ashes, everyone knew of her illness and death. There'd been a fundraising drive for her clinic expenses. A few of her closest old friends had traveled to visit in Tijuana, and thousands of emails about her condition had been exchanged. A strange sonnet was posted online less than 2 weeks after her death by the Acker Society of Gothenburg, Sweden. These news are not for real. We have nothing more to feel. Death again has put us in trances, but you will always be in my dances. I cannot take much more. What on earth are we here for? You were a prostitute, some kind of whore. Kathy, you have made your final score. Acker died a month after arriving in Tijuana. During the last weeks of her life, the writer and artist Matthias Viegner became her constant companion, her next of kin, overseeing her treatment at the clinic, coordinating visits from friends, and acting as a clearinghouse for all the related communication. They'd met about 7 years prior when Acker gave a reading with Dennis Cooper in LA at Beyond Baroque. They connected immediately. She'd just moved back to San Francisco from London. Viegner invited her to read at CalArts, where he taught. He'd see her when he was in San Francisco, and sometimes she'd ride her motorcycle down to LA, where she'd stay at his house, and they'd drive out to the hot springs. Viegner traveled to see her in San Francisco after she underwent a mastectomy in April '96. Her then-boyfriend, Charles Charmurray, had flown in from London to be with her during the surgery. When Viegner arrived, he found Acker miserable, weak, and pissed that he hadn't come sooner. She wanted to be taken care of, but not treated as if she was sick, which she found impossible. He had a strong feeling then she was going to die. As he would write later, I knew she was going to die and how she would die, and that I would be there because I wasn't afraid of it. Or if I was, it was minuscule in proportion to her fear of it, so it was blotted out. After the mastectomy, she turned her back on Western medicine, a decision she'd eventually describe in an essay, The Gift of Disease, and a libretto, Eurydice of the Underworld, in the Underworld. She stayed in San Francisco for 3 months after the surgery, consulting psychics, astrologers, healers, nutritionists, and a past life regressionist in Marin County. By July, her healers agreed she was now cancer-free, and she left San Francisco to live with Charmurray in London as planned. 2 of the practitioners Acker consulted would later be indicted in other cases for medical fraud. However, those closest to Acker came to agree that the claims of her healers were more metaphoric than fraudulent, which was not unlike the extrapolations in Acker's first-person writings and interviews, which, if misread as literal truths, could then be dismissed as falsehoods. Acker's domestic arrangement with Charmurray didn't last long. 2 months after arriving, she bought an apartment in Islington and fell sick again with an illness she ascribed to littoral poisoning. Walking with Murray on a towpath beside the Regent's Canal, she dropped her Evian bottle into the river. He scrambled down to retrieve it, and she'd tell herself and her readers and friends over and over again about how she'd contracted a viral infection when the polluted water seeped under the cap. She was reacting to tainted water. He'd given her poison to drink. It wasn't cancer at all. Still sick, she traveled to Virginia for a visiting writer job at a small college during the spring '97 semester. When she got back to London, she was exhausted and isolated and saw no point in staying. Viegner and others thought she should move back to California. In early September, she arrived back in San Francisco via Chicago, where she'd performed with the Meat Guns, checked into a hotel, and consulted her healers. She didn't reach out to Viegner or other old friends until mid-October. As Bob Gluck recalls, she attributed her illness to bad water. She was very constipated and instructed me to bring a certain enema. I couldn't find it, and so she didn't use the one I brought, because everything was done according to Frank Molinaro, her astrologer, and he had not authorized this one. She called him every hour or less, consulting him on every move. He passed out business cards at her funeral. Isn't that incredible? As though Kathy's fate was an advertisement for him. I gave Kathy a back massage. She was very thin. I tried to figure out what to do for her. She was in deeply serious pain, the kind of pain that makes you frantic. It seemed to me she had entered a magical world. She did not really want to associate with people outside of it. When she finally called Wagner, he offered to drive up and bring her back to his house in LA to regain her bearings. But when he arrived, he saw she was clearly too sick to be moved. He, Mare, and Grace convinced her to go to a hospital where doctors confirmed that the cancer had spread to most of her body. I don't understand, she told Wagner. I have cancer everywhere. My healers told me I had no cancer. When I asked my master healer, the teacher of all the healers, he told me he saw no cancer because I would not let him see cancer. He can only see what I let him see. So teachers are mirrors. Her body was cremated at the Funeraria del Carmen in Tijuana, and somehow Wagner, who was now her executor, transported the ashes across the border in a sealed aluminum tin. The question became what to do with them. Acker left no instructions about the arrangements because she didn't want to die. She'd only been coaxed into writing a will when the question of what would become of her work was posed as a hypothetical game. A flurry of emails passed between him and Ira Silverberg, Acker's former agent and friend. A mutual friend had offered his garden, but that didn't seem right. Let X find other fertilizer for his garden. You should do as you please, Silverberg wrote. I still think a little in San Francisco, London, and New York City would be nice, he proposed, not unreasonably. A few miles away from the clinic, people continue to visit the gravesite of Juan Soldado, a dubious folk hero whose remains are interred where he was shot by a firing squad in 1938. Candles and stones, bracelets and pennies and figurines. Thank you, Juan Soldado, for bringing my son. Thank you for granting my immigration. Thank you with all my heart for the protection you gave me in my hour of anguish, the small engraved plaques and handwritten notes say. I'm writing this essay in Punta Banda, about 80 miles south of the border, although nominally I live in LA. Born and raised in Auckland, New Zealand, the artist Simon Denny now lives and works in Berlin. His partner, a curator, is Italian. In Mexicali, an enormous mural in Centennial Square by Carlos Ortega Coronado is protected by 24-hour guard. The painting, Un siglo fertil, is an homage to the native Cucapa Indians and the perpetual struggle for water and land. Coronado, a veteran of Mexicali's 68 movement, has been at odds with his government's institutions all of his life, but the mural is valued. I was taught, writes Camus Daoud, the Los Angeles poet and cultural activist, that the concept of a local artist is a noble one, that to live and work in a community and to be known for that work is very dignified. The idea of a national art is as anomalous as the border. Contemporary artists are Greek or Estonian or Australian or South African born, leaving those places for international cities to launch their careers in their late teens or early 20s. Greek-born Berlin-based artist Yorgos Apanoutsis stages videotaped sculptural interventions upon the city's historic landmarks and memorials. As he explained in an interview, when I moved to Berlin, I didn't know who the public sculptures depicted. I just knew they were important for somebody. But on the other hand, I love to visit them and wonder, why are they here? Will they always be here? To remain in one place is either privation or luxury. No one I know who's died in my lifetime, no matter their age, has been interred in a grave. No matter how loved or accomplished or distinguished these friends have been, there are no scholarship funds in their names, no plaques, no memorial benches or arches. The reasons for this, I suppose, have been detailed in books like Robert Powell's Bowling Alone, but I still find it hard to accept. Where to inter the remains of those who live in a state of perpetual transience? He divides his time between New York and Maine, between Berlin and LA, between Jakarta and Sydney, the bios all say. So why not the ashes? In San Francisco, Viegner and other friends found a French Beaux-Arts vase in an antique shop that would serve as an urn. A decision was made to hold a memorial wake at Bob Gluck and Chris Kamader's home on Friday, December 13th. People would speak, and there'd be a ceremony to transfer the ashes from the can to the vase. The dining room table would be used as an altar, and Shepherd Paul, a Buddhist practitioner, diviner, and healer, and longtime partner of the poet Diane de Prima, would be asked to preside. 17 people gathered that night at Gluck and Kamader's house. Powell led the group in a meditation, breathing in fear and confusion and chaos, breathing out calm and peace. And then he recited a Tibetan chant for her spirit's release. There was a publicity headshot on the altar, some lilies, and a little stuffed dog. As Kevin Killian recalls, the house was, quote, filled with new agey type people who had helped Kathy in her last years. Tattooists, bodybuilders, motorcycle girls, SM practitioners, herbalists. It was almost like an upstairs-downstairs thing. Kathy had hired most of these people at one time or another. They were the service people, I thought snobbishly, but very few artists or writers who were her peers. The ritual had this creepy otherworldliness to it, this sacredness, Dodie Bellamy would write in her diary the next day, as if Kathy were behind the scenes directing our movements, and people were shedding real tears. Kathy's chosen truly loved her, nice people. A young, end quote, a young Amazonian woman named Juliet who knew Acker from Gold Gym cut open the can, and then people were asked to approach the altar alone and commune with the ashes by scooping a cup into the vase. Bellamy couldn't do it. Killian dipped 3 fingers into the jar and licked them off with his hand. Ingesting her ashes was a symbolic means of reincarnating some of the dead hero's genius. He'd done it before with his friend Sam D'Alessandro's cremains. Viegner was horrified, but then he did it too. As he'd write later, what hit me most was that Kay would have no choice about whom her ashes inhabited. Whatever the meaningless relation between ashes and human, some choice was being made available again. My first decision as literary executor. Although mostly, Aileen May recalls, it was messy. It works best, she emailed last week, with a paper cone. Viegner selected the Fort Funston Park site because he remembered how much Acker loved walking there. A short drive south of the city, the park has a spectacular view of the open Pacific. Wide paths dotted with wind-dwarf cypress and junipers cut over the bluffs. At the park's steepest point, it's a 200-foot drop to the waves. People arrived at the park that afternoon in separate cars. It was a smaller group than at the memorial. Acker's friend, the editor Amy Shoulder, had flown in from New York. Aileen Mayer and Sharon Grace were both there. Bob Gluck, Viegner, Shepherd Powell, and the astrologer Frank Molinaro. Mel Freilicher, a longtime friend of Acker's from San Diego, may have been there. As people got out of their cars and assembled, Molinaro passed out business cards. The general plan was to release the ashes into the sea, although Shoulder wondered about this because she recalled that Acker feared drowning. But then again, as Viegner recalls, she was afraid of death, period, in any concrete way, although it runs through all of her work. The group took a steep, sandy path down one of the dunes, and Viegner carried the urn. Aileen Mayer recalls Shepherd Powell reciting Diane de Prima's poem, Litany, to Kathy Acker. that she'd written in response to Rudolph Giuliani's attempt to shut down the Sensation show at the Brooklyn Museum because of Christoph painting the Holy Virgin Mary, which was spouted with elephant dung. Our Lady of Mandrake, Our Lady of the Bayou, Our Lady of Subways, Our Lady of Blind Cats, Our Lady of Albino Alligators, Our Lady of Desperados, our 300-pound lady who sits on stoops in a house dress in the summer night, Our Lady of Tenements. Although in a literal sense, this seems unlikely, because the exhibition wouldn't open in Brooklyn until October 1998, but in any event, it is a great poem. As the group scrambled down, the ignorant shoulder paused to wait for the others, and Frank Molinaro, the odd one out, the one nobody liked in this group, rushed up and grabbed the vase from his hands. The astrologer ran toward the sea, tossing handfuls of ash and bone while he proclaimed, "You're free, Kathy, you're finally free," before the ignorant shoulder wrested it back. It was bitterly cold, and no matter how hard they tried, no one could toss the ashes into the waves because the wind blew them back. It hardly felt final. The ignorant shoulder waded into the sea with the final cremains. After that, everyone trudged back up the dune and drove to the beach chalet bar up the road to talk and have drinks. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for these really great presentations. I think we have a perfect setup for opening the Q&A right away, but I would like just to say one thing that may launch this conversation and perhaps will connect certain dots in your talks. I was very thrilled. I guess it is certainly the most thrilling moment in your narrative. This difficulty of consensus regarding what to do with someone's remains, and the kind of debate that entails. I think it is something that has to be incredibly civilized and democratic. No one has really an authority to decide, which brought me to think about the peace mom, the case of the peace mom that Rosalyn described, because the way I understood your explanation, it seemed that this woman was basically claiming her right to memorialize her son in a civil way, in a fully personal way, honoring the full personhood and not just the military agency of that body on duty. And so this need to claim a right to memorialize a person as such seems like a very interesting area where you can analyze, debate, and critique the different forms of memorialization, of monumentalization. So I would like to just throw the question to you, like, oh, this is better, thank you. You know, how, for instance, Rosalyn, would you look at this transition between the personal and the political and back in the case of Peace Mom and her son Casey, and how would you, Chris, interpret the political forms of memorialization and the kind of debate that this would entail? And I remember we discussed the case of Juan Soldado, a prisoner who was executed near the border, I think near Tijuana also. And who has become a saint, and well, supposedly he was unjustly executed and accused, and now he's a saint for immigrants. So again, there are different forms of claiming the memory and the monument in this funerary situation. So I would just like to throw the question to you both.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, they're such different things. There's such different things. That was the beautiful description that you gave of what Cindy Sheehan did, and I remember that time. I mean, that was, yeah, the beautiful description of Cindy Sheehan's encampment in Texas and her activism afterwards. I mean, that's an intangible memorial, but that was the best possible memorial in response to that situation. But this, the political that you're talking about, it's such a different impulse than, I guess, the thing that I was thinking about in relation to Kathy and to, dead friends, in a very kind of personal way. How do we remember? Things move so fast. And I mean, in my own life, I've seen these numerous deaths occur, both, in their time and prematurely. And, you walk around cities that have plaques, campuses. You have memorial arches. The class of 1937 made a memorial arch for their fallen friend, and their memorials and, the memorial bench and the plaque everywhere. And no one that I know has the time or inclination to do such a thing anymore. And I wonder about that. But I mean, it's completely different from the political gesture, which when it's intangible is often more effective.
Well, it's really interesting. Is this working? Oh, okay. Chris, what you're saying, because actually all through your talk, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
All through your talk, I was reminded of a passage in Joseph Roth's book, The Radetzky March. Have you ever read that?
I don't know.
Well, there's a point where someone dies, and the narrator talks about it being, he talks more like from the present, but he looks back and he says, this was a time when, before the war, when people actually grieved, right? So it's like a really beautiful passage, and he describes the extent of his mourning for this person that no longer happens. And I don't know if that is related to what you're saying about these memorials not being there anymore. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about Cindy Sheehan. What happened with her was that first she was just sort of in shock about her son's death, of course, and was sort of drawn into the official, Bush. She saw Bush, and he said, he didn't even know the name of her son when he met her. I mean, there's a book called Peace Mom that she's written. And so it gradually dawned on her. She became politicized gradually and decided that, and then she decided at one point she regretted having him buried as a soldier and not as a human, which was interesting distinction. But it was at that point that she wanted his death to have political meaning. So it was no longer just personal. I don't think you can even draw a distinction between the personal and political in her case, because she was mobilizing other mothers, she was working with other mothers, although there were also all these mothers who were opposed to what she was doing. So for her, the important thing would be that her son's memorial would be something that would be an anti-war memorial that would prevent other sons' deaths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see your point, Rosalyn. It is very clear that it was a political gesture, but and a personal one. But it brought me to think that basically when you address the political power in this kind of conflict and claim a right like this, even if you were not to utilize the case of your lost son to to enter an anti-war campaign that is perfectly legitimate. But even if you would just claiming the body for totally personal reasons, it's just like trying to withdraw the right of the state to instrumentalize a body for this kind of memorial. I think it will be a political gesture. Yes. In all case, it is a political action. And meanwhile, I think this brings us to the area where the personal memorial is set and where all these codes have to be figured out, which again is political because, as Chris was describing so nicely, we have some sort of assembly of people that have to decide on the specific technology of memory that is to be implemented there, because this person is to be remembered properly. And that has an incredible game of back and forth with what you actually remember, what you don't, what is just and not what corresponds or not, almost in a literary way. There's some sort of correspondence between the object and the image that you're creating, right? So I'm very interested in the way you can circulate from one field to the other.
I suppose that once there's a contestation, I was saying that once there's a contestation over how to memorialize somebody, that in some ways that's already political, right? But I think there's, I don't know that you can really bring together this very personal situation of memorialization. Like you said, we're going from the macro to the micro level. I'm not sure they can actually work that well together.
Yeah. Well, in one of the works that you talked about, it was like the turning a symbol inside out.
Mm-hmm.
It was so startling and
right.
powerful. These are symbols that are so banal, we're just inured to them, we don't see them at all.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're suddenly recontextualized, well, they have a new meaning. And people have to pay attention.
But the new meaning is already in present.
Yes.
Like in the case of Nike, it's already present there, but it's repressed. And there might be a similarity with the situation you're describing, where the memorials for Kathy Acker are, what was, not being said, what would be what's being covered up, exactly. That kind of thing. Is analogous, I think.
Yeah. Before I give the mic to Lynn, I would just for the record, because it came to my memory, listening to. Oh yeah. Just for the record, because I remember this, and I think it was as I was listening to. I think both your talks. For some reason, this image came back to my mind twice. But I was recently in Geneva, and I, of course, visited Jorge Luis Borges' grave. And so as I lingered around trying to get the halo of the of this monument, which Jorge Luis Borges. Borges. And so the grave is basically it's flat, it's lawn, but there's a stone engraved with ancient English. I think it's a verse of Beowulf, and then like a traditional inscription, like a drawing of, I don't know, a ship, and something very heroic, very Borges-like. Right behind this grave that is very heroic and very very legendary, in the sense that he was really always thinking out his life in terms of that legend and so on and so forth, which is a military legend, and again a legend of war, a legend of masculinity. Behind there is a grave of a very, very mysterious character, and I will send you both the image because I think it deserves being researched by someone. Maybe I'll do it too. But it's a woman, and the inscription very simply is a metal plate. It says her name, I don't remember, and says writer, prostitute, painter. Huh. And so it's a completely opposite figure. It's a femme du monde, in a way.
It's a what?
A femme du monde, instead of homme du monde, in the Baudelairean terms. It's this woman who has lived through the world, who has experienced the entire
Writer, prostitute, what was the third?
Painter, writer, and prostitute. And very, very, very weird. I guess when I was listening to the poem about Kathy Acker, this completely came in more strongly. But I just wanted to say this. I don't know why. It's very powerful.
Is there any other information on the grave? Is it anonymous?
No, it has a name. I just don't remember it because, again, I took a photo a few months ago.
And what are the dates?
I think it was like early 20th century to like half of the century, something like that. But yeah, very interesting case. I just wanted to put it out there. So maybe it's a PhD thesis soon. Anyway, I think we have a first question. Someone has a microphone. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Both talks were wonderful. I was wondering if a bridge between Rosalyn's and Chris's talks could be constructed from the notion of the intangible. Chris, you were talking about there's no tangible marking after a friend. Many friends of yours have died, and there are no markers for that, nothing tangible. And then I began thinking about Rosalyn's discussion of the duty of memory, which also can be intangible, or that memory itself, just remembering, is intangible. And I just wondered if that would be a link between the two of you in some way.
Or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier type of monument would fit in with what you're talking about. I was saying that the whole convention, which started with World War I, of the unknown soldiers, monuments, burial grounds, things like that, where you have, a body that nobody knows who it is, right, is, I think, related to the intangibility, maybe, of, what you were talking about. Yeah. But I think, in part of my talk, I talked about the way in memorials, actually the bodies are absent anyway, right? And what they're inscribed with are names. So the body, they're not tombs, really. I mean, occasionally they will be. But so there is this play of absence and presence in war memorials, always.
Yeah, I think there is another interesting bridge. I see two questions. Another interesting bridge between the case of the body bag that you described, when these very sophisticated weapons scattered the living body into that similar to sand, and the soldier is carrying something to gather and perhaps to exorcise this idea of a loss that it's unrecoverable and intangible. Suddenly the body and life becomes intangible, and which I guess epitomizes what is haunting in death, this intangibility.
Yeah, well, that, there's this whole, it raises the whole question of the significance of the object in relation to all memory, but particularly traumatic memory. So I remember seeing a film once about a Holocaust survivor, and in the film he was, I don't remember it exactly, but he was brought back to where he had lived, and everybody, of course, was dead. And the filmmakers brought him on a tour of the whole area, and he kept collecting just little pieces of dirt and putting them in different plastic bags. And, before they left, there was every time they were at a site, before they left, there was this, urgency for him to, just grab something. And the film never talked about it. But it's so poignant, this idea of what was the purpose. But maybe it has to do with the intangibility of the actual loss that somehow the hope is to render it tangible in some way, right? I mean, it recalls a personal experience I had after 9/11 when I was, it was very soon after 9/11, and my husband and I were walking down 14th Street, and there was a church, and there were all these pictures or names of undocumented workers who may have been killed in 9/11 attack, and people were stopping in front of the church and crossing themselves, and I suddenly felt like I wanted to cross myself, like I wanted there to be something to do. Now, it's a little bit different from the tangible piece of earth, but I don't think it's that far distant, that you're facing something so unfathomable. This, death is like an absence that's so great, you can't really take it in, that you want to somehow be able to, I don't know what, represent it or something.
Yeah. So we have a first question. I think it was you came first.
This is coming from somebody who signed their will yesterday. The notion of tangible, intangible, presence, and absence, relationally to something specific, and it's hard for me not to ask this question, being so aware of what the internet now provides in terms of images of people, and that you can almost come upon somebody in an image without even looking or knowing, and reminding ourselves of this tangible, intangible. And ultimately, isn't memory somewhat that? The notion of tearing up, or as you spoke, the crossing, or some way of expressing an intangible or an emotion. Is there any way to disconnect the two things?
Well, I don't think that's really memory, this desire to express something.
Of lost person. That what I meant was just a lost person, a dead soldier, a mother.
I mean, memory is a representation of the past, right? So I think that's different from, obviously the tearing up has something to do with memory. You're right about that, but I don't think I wasn't thinking of the crossing oneself or taking the piece of earth as necessarily, well, the taking the piece of earth is, but it's different from, that's different for me from than memory.
Rosalyn, this is for you. Your vivid, detailed descriptions of what happens in war with IUDs, with IEDs, USD, whatever. I'm not very good with, it's neither here nor there. And the fact that soldiers do not visualize what might happen to them when they go to war, nor do the politicians. It's all hidden. I mean, the execrable destruction of the body, the eviscerations, and it occurred to me also that Muslim jihadists do not think of this either. They are thinking of their invulnerability and immortality in the next life with all the virgins and all that. So, what do you think that bringing these images to the fore, which is not done in any religion, in any social environment, milieu, would this be work toward a deterrent?
For people going to war, for soldiers going to war.
Yeah.
I don't think so. My first thought is I don't think so. And because from a psychoanalytic perspective, you can, read all about this or even see these images and still isolate that death as something that only happens to someone else, particularly the enemy. That, the power of the disavowal is so strong. So the reason I included those descriptions in today's talk was that not so much that I think they would be a deterrent for soldiers or people signing up to be soldiers, but I think that those of us who are not soldiers should know about this. And as you said, it's completely hidden. The description of the soldiers scurrying around with the body bag is taken from a book by Ann Jones, the reporter, called They Were Soldiers, How U.S. Soldiers Are Returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, something like that. I don't have the subtitle exactly right. But the things that she writes about are things that we don't know about. I mean, they are purposely hidden, like huge factory-size facilities for putting the remains together as best they can, right? Things like this that are going on, both over there in other European countries and also stateside, as they say, in military language. So I feel that it is something that people should know about that's being purposely hidden. But I think in terms of the deterrent, I don't think that's what the kind of feeling of invulnerability that I was describing, the heroic feeling that Freud describes, is on an unconscious level. It's not on a conscious level.
But what if demonstrators, we before the Iraq War, hundreds of thousands of people protested the imminent invasion of Iraq. What if we had made banners with this kind of imagery? Why haven't we done this?
I think for purposes of education, it would be really important. But of course, we did that during the Vietnam War with the End Babies campaign, remember? End Babies and the pictures of, they weren't as graphic, but there's pictures of...
No, but the images of what will happen to you, to the soldiers.
Addressing them to the soldiers. Yeah, what do you think?
I don't know, it's something that hasn't been done.
Yeah, because they are not shown. Even there, I mean, Ann Jones's book really describes how they try to keep the soldiers from seeing the dead bodies. They turn them into images immediately. They just post a picture of the person who's the dead soldier and get rid of the body immediately. But they see it anyway. I mean, if they're there long enough, they're going to see it. So the Marine captain I described, for example, he only had that feeling of invulnerability until his men started to actually get killed. So maybe, yes, maybe there is. I don't know.
Actually, I have a question for Chris, and that is about memorializing someone through writing. And it seems to me that if it is a book, a biography, or even if it's not a biography, but if Kathy Acker figures prominently in whatever you're writing, which I assume will be published, then that too is a memorial, is it not? And that too sort of, it's not like it's a plaque on the street, but nevertheless, it becomes a kind of memorial. And I was thinking about that activity as well. Can you speak about that at all? Are you thinking about that?
Can I catch up with you, Sarah? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, the biography a biography does memorialize a person, for sure. Although that's not exactly my interest in writing this biography. My interest is more in creating a history of a time. Some of the times that I was present for and others that I wasn't. I mean, I'm not inclined to write about those times in any kind of, the times that I was present for, in any kind of memoiristic way, but revisiting them using Kathy almost as a surrogate. I mean, I didn't know her well, and we were certainly very different people, but in a way, the subject of the biography becomes a surrogate for the writer. It's a way of doing autofiction, I think, at a second remove. Through intense, not identification, but empathy with the character whose life you're writing, it becomes a way of telling that history without having to insert your own particular history into it, but in a personal way. I mean, there always needs to be, in a fiction or a quasi-fictional book, there always needs to be, a personal drama that you're following. And Kathy Acker's life lends itself so well to this because she did nothing. I mean, since the beginning of her career, one of her highest goals, she seriously believed in literature, but she also seriously believed in creating herself as a cultural icon, by whatever means necessary. And it's very interesting to me how that iconography was created. It also seems to me now completely anachronistic. That kind of iconography doesn't mean the same thing anymore. I mean, the great writer, as a cultural spokesperson, that niche doesn't even, the niche that she fought so hard for barely exists in the culture anymore at all. And so these seem to be interesting questions to explore through the crucible of her life. So rather than memorialize her, I think it's more a way of interrogating parts of history.
But even, can I have that? I mean, I think I turned it off. Oh, okay. Back on? Okay, even so, you're making a distinction between history and memory when you say this. So what do you see as the difference? Because I don't think they can actually be separate. I mean, for example, are you interviewing people for your book?
Yes, I am.
So you're...
It's not very useful. The more useful interviews were the ones that I did before I was seriously writing the book in 2000, much closer to the time of her death, when all of the antagonisms and hatreds and feuds were still very much alive. And now when I talk to people 17 years later, they speak in a very eulogistic way. They don't even remember particular incidents that lead to them feeling the way that they feel. They're speaking for the record. The much more useful material is in the archives, reading what people were saying back and forth to each other in real time.
So what do you think is the difference between history and memory in your book? Like, what is history kind of the factual material?
These are such big words, history and memory, that it's hard to know how to start to talk about them. But I mean, I guess I can just say that for me, history, it's more like a detective story, it's like trying to uncover the real facts. And some of the real facts can be uncovered in the documents. The real facts of at least who were the players and what was at stake, what did they want at the time, what were the feuds, what were the issues. And it's by creating, by revisiting those little dramas. I'm just fascinated by, what can be a trigger to a period, and certain artworks do that. You look at certain artworks and they're fantastic triggers to a period. For me, a book that was really important was The Big Fat William Gaddis' book, The Recognitions. I mean, the early 60s in New York, a period I never lived through, but the colors, I mean, it did everything to create that history and the atmosphere of a history.
Are you trying in any way, though, I mean, is there anything comparable, like I talk about official memory, right, of war, which is really kind of, state-sponsored memory or instrumental memory. Is there anything equivalent to that in terms of your work on Acker?
Well, you say you talk about memory in terms of official memory, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, so that's a problem that I'm confronting talking to people 17 years later, is that so much of it has become official memory. Right?
And so you're seeing the history part as the critical partner, sort of challenging the official memory.
Absolutely.
Because memory can also play the part of the critical partner when there's an official history.
Yeah.
Right? So these are like not really, they're so enmeshed, as they say,
Yes.
the two terms.
I think another big motivation for me to write the book was the spate of memoirs that have come out in the last 5 years or so from people about, the kind of complete glamorization of like New York in the 80s. And, I was here for that. It was like the worst time in my life. So I'm really kind of at odds with the way that it's memorialized. And I'm very interested in kind of getting close to the texture of how things actually were, and then by extension, discovering
Or at least how you remember them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, and discovering the texture of how things were in, other periods, the poetry world in the 70s that I have no experience of in San Diego, but just to kind of pierce the official story and to get some sense of the feeling. I just reread Sentimental Education by Flaubert recently, and it's another great attempt through description of things. I mean, it's like one Turner and Constable painting after another. His descriptions of how things looked in his youth is so much more telling than what people say they remember of their youth.
Yeah. Another question? We have room for maybe one or two more questions. Okay.
Chris, can you hear me? You can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. I'm interested in this idea of the hero. It's been coming up a lot for me lately. And I was reminded of something during this talk, a story that my grandmother told me, who lived through the occupation under the Germans in Paris. And she lived near Notre Dame, the cathedral. And she would walk by Notre Dame and hear Beethoven playing from inside. And this was very beautiful, but she felt obviously very conflicted about this. For reasons I don't have to explain, but it strikes me that this is the sort of danger of being a hero. And especially today, a hero is one who can be used and misused and abused and used to someone else's ends, like Beethoven was by the Germans and Nietzsche and so on. This is especially true now, and I'm just interested because we don't have war heroes anymore. We have Bo Bergdahl or someone like this. Someone who, like in the 70s, coming back from Vietnam, is ridiculed and made, into a farce, and shamed because we're afraid of what the soldier is going to say, perhaps. I know probably what you're going to say, Chris, but what is your relationship to Kathy? She's not a hero, but what is she to you? Maybe.
Okay. You go first.
Wait, gotta catch up with that, Julian. Hang on.
Oh, well, then maybe I should.
So you want to make it one question or two questions?
Okay, where's my bet? The German occupation?
Well, yeah.
Is that me? No, that's gotta be you.
He's asking you specifically.
Oh, what is Kathy to you?
Yes.
Oh,
Is she a hero?
that's the question for me. she's another writer. She's another writer. Martha Rosler and I did an amazing conversation in the year 2000 that she made me swear we would never publish. She knew Kathy because her first husband left her for Kathy when she had a small child. And so we're kind of sitting around dishing the dirt for an hour or so. And at the end, she said this great thing, and it was the one thing that I could use, which was, she's like talking about what a careerist is, how ambitious, how apolitical Kathy is. But then she says, but I could have been Kathy. Kathy could have been me. You could have been me. I could have been you. We're all the same. Of course, we're ambitious. It doesn't really matter. There's a similarity between us. And so, yeah, Kathy is someone who was, in a similar, I wasn't a close friend of hers, I hardly knew her, but we passed through a similar, some of the same times in history. And so, especially because she was such a great mythologizer, she becomes a figure, a story that can help tell other stories. She becomes kind of the master story that can tell other stories. And then I guess also there was this incredibly snide and disparaging and nasty thing that Richard Hell wrote in his autobiography about having sex with Kathy. It was 2 lines, not just Kathy, it was Kathy Acker, and that was all he said about her. And I think that kind of clinched it for me, and it's she so didn't deserve that. Yeah, I want to write a book.
So my answer to my part of your question, I'm talking about the hero in a very specific sense. So I don't have any problem with hero, small h, I'm sure I have some heroes in that regard. I'm talking about the hero as the narcissistic ego, that in order to construct itself as invulnerable, has to engage in either the conquest or the subordination of the other, or what is different. So I'm using hero in a very specialized sense, and I think it's the sense that Barbara Kruger has in mind. So it's the phallocentric subject, including the phallocentric society, right?
Oh, could I add something to the answer to Juliana about Kathy? Semiotics did another project a few years ago about the artist David Wojnarowicz, and that also became a kind of anti-biography. Sylvia Lochinger, who'd been a friend of David's, shortly after Wojnarowicz's death, he made a lot of long interviews with people who were close to David or who had worked with David. And they went into the closet, untranscribed, forgotten about for years. And originally, he thought he would make a book that was like the George Plimpton, Edie Sedgwick book with all these little quotes, like Chloe Griffin did with Cookie Mueller. But when we looked at it, a decade passed, and when we looked at it 10 or 15 years later, and we read these 8,000-word interviews with these people, it was oh my God, the history of the era is there in these little things that the people remembered, just a year or two after his death. And so even though the book was ostensibly about David Wojnarowicz, it was really much more a history of an era.
Your last question? Oh, yeah, there was another one. Agnieszka. There's a couple. Yeah, there are 2 of them, yeah. There's one behind too, yeah. Okay, those 2.
I have a question for Rosalyn Deutsche about something that I would call a existence of some kind of invisible, silent wars of some sort between monuments around different acts of heroism. And I very often in public space in Europe, I'm Polish, so I witnessed it personally. There are places where there are several competing discourses around different heroes, represented. Usually behind each hero there is a different political option, obviously identifying with a different discourse. And I witnessed it once in Warsaw, where this very same square, at the very same square in Warsaw, 3 different political parties funded memorials for heroes of 3 different wars. One was the heroes of the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, not the main monument that is in Warsaw, but a smaller one. At the same crossing, there is a monument of a Polish priest who, in the 1980s, was fighting with the communist totalitarian regime and was assassinated by the KGB, and a third monument of heroes of a Polish uprising in the 19th century. And these 3 discourses were kind of superimposing and obviously competing for both like the space in terms of public space, but also, and I'm interested in, whether you explored in your research, because I think it's an interesting subject of this kind of actually wars between monuments of different kind of heroism.
It's really interesting, and I don't want to say too much. I mean, I don't know the Polish context well enough. I mean, I have been there, but so maybe maybe there is a problem. I mean, that's interesting that there's some kind of democratic context, but maybe there's a problem in conducting it as a contest among heroes, right? That could be problematic. By contrast, let's say, with Phil Yu's proposal, which has something similar in it, right? An exchange of memorials, but for a particular purpose that has to do with questioning the self, the nation, etc.
Okay, last question. Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah. So this is, I think it's mostly for Rosalyn, and pardon my English, it's not my first language. And I'm really interested in your work. I have heard you on talks, but I haven't read your books yet, which I will the next couple of days. But I'm really not interested at all in psychoanalysis. And I will, yeah. So this is, yeah. And it's this notion of we are evil people, humans are evil people. That's my problem with psychoanalysis. I would really like you to turn me on to psychoanalysis, and kind of this is. So the question then will be, with this idea of a civic society, a civic society. If there's a place in psychoanalysis for us to overcome barbarism, I think we are living in barbarism. The civic society now is barbaric.
In a way, I think psychoanalysis offers the only theory of barbarism there is. I think that in order to change a situation, one has to understand it. And psychoanalysis is a theory of cruelty. And I don't think there is any other discourse that theorizes cruelty. That's why I said, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to the economic, as I said in my talk, the ideological, the economic, the political, and I had one other in that mantra, but of course those are causes and problems. But cruelty is another issue. Just as I think war is another issue. You have conflicts that are economic, you have conflicts that are political, ideological, etc., but when they express themselves in the form of war, then you have something new has come into existence that can't just be reduced to the economic, ideological, political, etc. So that's my answer.
All right, well, I think we went through this afternoon in a very beautiful way. And it's still sunny outside, so I want to thank you all for staying with us, for following this series. The will be a publication one day, as it is customary with this series. And I can just say thank you again, and good evening.